April 1945. A prisoner of war camp in rural Texas received a shipment of new supplies from the War Department. Nothing unusual about that. Camps regularly received shipments of food, clothing, and equipment. But this particular shipment contained something extraordinary. Something that would challenge everything the German women prisoners believed about their American captors. Something that would force them to confront the lies they had been told about their enemy. The shipment contained Easter supplies, candy, decorations, new clothes for the prisoners, materials for the women to create decorations in their barracks. Easter was coming, and someone at the highest levels of the American military had decided that even enemy prisoners deserved to celebrate the holiday. Before we reveal what happened when these German women realized they were receiving gifts from people they had been taught to despise, tell us where you are watching from in the comments below. The camp had been established in 1943 as a facility to house German prisoners of war. By 1945, it housed approximately 200 German prisoners, of whom 60 were women. The women had been captured during the final push into Germany, as Allied forces advanced from the west. They had served in various capacities for the Luftwaffe, the German Air Force. They were not hardened soldiers. They were not ideological Nazis. They were ordinary women who had found themselves caught up in the machinery of war, who had volunteered or been conscripted into military service, who had done their jobs and then had been captured when their side began to lose. The camp commander was Colonel Thomas Harrington, a career military officer in his early 50s who had served in World War I and had returned to active duty after retirement. He was a by-the-book officer who followed military regulations strictly, but he was not a cruel man. He believed that treating prisoners humanely was not just a matter of international law, but also a matter of honor and character. A soldier's treatment of prisoners revealed the true nature of that soldier's country and culture. Colonel Harrington had received authorization from his superiors to create a more structured recreational program for the prisoners, both male and female. He believed that giving prisoners something to do beyond just surviving the day would improve morale, reduce behavioral problems, and make the camp easier to manage. He had authorized the formation of prisoner orchestras, sports teams, and educational classes. The women prisoners had begun to organize events and activities that gave them purpose and structure in their confinement. When the shipment of Easter supplies arrived, Colonel Harrington faced a decision. The supplies were meant for American soldiers and civilian populations, but he had received orders to maintain Geneva Convention standards, which meant providing prisoners with basic respect and dignity. He decided that the Easter supplies should be distributed to the prisoners as well. They deserved the chance to celebrate their religious traditions, he reasoned, and Easter was a meaningful holiday for Christian believers regardless of their nationality. The decision was controversial. Some of his subordinates questioned why American prisoners should share resources with enemy nationals. Letters of complaint began to arrive from the surrounding community. How could American soldiers be giving enemy prisoners Easter gifts? How could American taxpayers be funding celebrations for people who had tried to kill American soldiers? But Colonel Harrington held firm. He issued an order that the Easter supplies would be distributed to all prisoners, German and Italian alike, male and female. He issued a statement explaining his reasoning. He wrote that the United States was fighting to defend freedom and human dignity, that those values meant nothing if Americans only extended them to people they liked or agreed with. That true character was revealed in how people treated those they had every reason to mistreat. The day the Easter supplies were distributed to the women prisoners was a day that many of them would remember for the rest of their lives. Martha Kruger, a 28-year-old former administrative worker from Berlin, remembered standing in line with the other women, uncertain what to expect. She had learned to be wary of American intentions, not because she had been mistreated, but because she had been conditioned by years of propaganda to expect the worst. When an American soldier handed her a small package wrapped in colored paper, she had stared at it as if it might explode. Inside the package was Easter candy, chocolate eggs wrapped in foil, hard candies in pastel colors, and a simple note written in careful German script, "Happy Easter." We hope this brings you joy during a difficult time. From the soldiers and staff of Camp Harrington. Martha had stood holding the package, completely overwhelmed. She had not received a gift since her capture. She had not expected kindness. She had expected to be treated as a prisoner, as an enemy, as someone who deserved punishment for having served the Nazi regime. But instead, she was being given Easter candy and a note wishing her happiness. She had looked up at the American soldier who had handed her the package. His name was Private Robert Chen, a young soldier from California whose parents had immigrated from China. He was watching her face carefully, reading her reaction. "Are you all right?" he asked in English. Martha understood enough English to catch the gist of the question. She had nodded, though she was not sure if she was all right. She was confused. She was moved. She was struggling to reconcile this act of kindness with the propaganda she had been taught about Americans being cruel and barbaric. That evening, in the barracks, the women opened their packages and examined the contents. The Easter candies were distributed, with each woman receiving a small portion. They had not tasted sugar in such quantities for years. In Germany, during the final years of the war, sugar had been rationed so severely that sweets had become impossible to find. For many of the women, the Easter candy represented not just food, but a connection to the world before the war, to a time when simple pleasures like sweets had been available. But it was not just the candy that affected them. It was the realization that Americans, people they had been taught were enemies, had thought of them at Easter. That someone, somewhere, had decided that German prisoners of war deserved to have a holiday acknowledged and celebrated. That kindness could exist even in the midst of war and captivity. Greta Hoffman, a 31-year-old former nurse, had asked a question that many of the women were thinking. Why are they doing this? Why do they care if we have Easter candy? We are German. We are the enemy. They have every reason to hate us. No one had a good answer. The only explanation was that Americans, at least some of them, did not operate on the logic of revenge and hatred. They operated on a different set of principles of dignity and respect, even for those who were technically their enemies. But the Easter supplies were just the beginning. Over the following weeks, the American staff at Camp Harrington continued to demonstrate a generosity that bewildered the German women prisoners. When the women mentioned in conversations with guards that they had not seen fresh fruit in months, arrangements were made for fresh apples to be provided at meals. When some of the women complained that they had no materials to do needlework, which had become a popular activity among the prisoners, supplies were donated by the American Red Cross. Private Chen noticed that several of the women had developed infections from wearing worn-out shoes that had been damaged during the long journey to the camp. He brought the problem to Colonel Harrington, who authorized the purchase of new shoes for the prisoners, not from military funds but from a prisoner welfare fund that had been established. The shoes were distributed, and women who had been suffering in pain were suddenly able to walk without agony. Word of these acts of generosity spread among the prisoner population. Other camps learned what was happening at Camp Harrington. Letters began to arrive from prisoners at other facilities, requesting transfers to Texas, hoping they might receive similar treatment. Some American soldiers at Camp Harrington began to be questioned by soldiers at other camps about why they were being so generous to enemy prisoners. Were they being too soft? Had they forgotten that Germany had tried to conquer the world? Had they lost sight of the fact that these women had been part of the military machine that had caused so much death and destruction? But Colonel Harrington would not be swayed. He continued to authorize generous treatment of the prisoners. He arranged for educational classes. He organized movie screenings where the women could watch Hollywood films, giving them a window into American culture and entertainment. He authorized the establishment of a small library where the women could read books in German to help them maintain their language and give them access to literature and ideas. One particular decision caused considerable controversy. A local church group approached Colonel Harrington about the possibility of providing Christmas gifts to the prisoners, even though Christmas was still months away. They wanted to begin preparing, they explained. They wanted to give the prisoners something to look forward to, something that would provide hope during their confinement. Colonel Harrington approved the request. He issued a statement explaining that providing hope to prisoners was not weakness or disloyalty to America. It was an affirmation of American values. It was a way of demonstrating that even in war, Americans believed in the essential dignity of all human beings. The church group began to collect donations. They organized fundraisers. They contacted churches across the state. By autumn, they had collected enough materials to provide each prisoner at Camp Harrington with a small gift. The gifts were simple: a new pair of socks, a bar of soap, a writing tablet and pencils, a handwritten Christmas card from a stranger in Texas wishing the prisoner well, and expressing hope that the war would end soon and that they could return to their families. When the Christmas gifts were distributed in December, the effect was profound. Many of the women cried when they received the handwritten cards. They read the messages from American strangers who had bothered to write to them, who had thought of them during the holiday season, who believed in their shared humanity despite the war. One woman, Elizabeth Berg, a 25-year-old from Munich who had worked as a radio operator, received a card from a woman named Sarah Johnson from Houston. The card contained a simple message: "I do not know you, but I know you are far from home during the holidays. I hope this small gift reminds you that not all of us are ruled by hatred. I hope you will return to Germany and tell your family that some Americans believe in peace and human dignity. I hope that someday our two countries can be friends. Merry Christmas." Elizabeth kept that card for the rest of her life. She showed it to her children and her grandchildren. She told them the story of the Christmas gift from an American stranger, a woman she had never met, who had shown her kindness when she expected cruelty. The impact of Colonel Harrington's policies became so well known that by the time the war ended in Europe in May 1945, Camp Harrington had gained a reputation as one of the most humane prisoner of war camps in America. Journalists began to write about it. Military historians began to study it as an example of how to treat prisoners ethically and humanely. But perhaps the most significant impact was on the women themselves. As the war came to an end and they faced repatriation to Germany, they began to realize that their experience in American captivity had fundamentally changed their understanding of America and Americans. They had been captured expecting to be treated cruelly. Instead, they had been treated with respect. They had been captured fearing Americans. Instead, they had learned to see Americans as complex human beings, some kind, some less so, but most of them capable of decency and generosity. Martha Kruger, who had been so shocked by the Easter candy, began to write in a journal about her experiences at the camp. She wrote about the guards who had shown her kindness. She wrote about Colonel Harrington, his decision to treat prisoners as human beings rather than as abstractions of enemy nationality. She wrote about the realization that she had been wrong about America, that America was not a nation ruled by barbarism and cruelty, but a nation where kindness and generosity were also valued. When she was repatriated to Germany in 1946, Martha brought her journal with her. She carried it through the ruins of Berlin, through the Allied occupation, through the process of rebuilding a destroyed nation. She kept it safe, protecting it as if it were a precious document. Years later, she published the journal as a book. The book became influential in Germany as a chronicle of how a German woman had been treated by her American captors. It offered a perspective that contradicted the propaganda that had been spread during the war. It suggested that reconciliation between America and Germany was possible, that understanding could bridge even the deepest divides created by war. Private Robert Chen, the soldier who had handed Martha her first Easter package, remained in the army after the war. He stayed at Camp Harrington until it was decommissioned in 1946. He corresponded with several of the German women prisoners, maintaining friendships that had been formed during their time in captivity. He used his experience at Camp Harrington as the foundation for a career devoted to military ethics and the humane treatment of prisoners. He eventually became an instructor at military academies, teaching future officers about the importance of treating all human beings with dignity, regardless of nationality or political beliefs. He told his students about the German women prisoners and the decision to provide them with Easter candy and Christmas gifts. He told them that this was not weakness. This was strength. This was the confidence of a nation secure enough in its values that it could afford to be generous even to its enemies. Colonel Harrington retired after the war and moved to a small town in Pennsylvania. He was invited to speak at various forums about his experience managing the camp. He consistently emphasized the same message, that the treatment of prisoners reflected the true character of a nation. That a nation that treated its prisoners with cruelty was a nation that was losing its way morally and spiritually. That America's greatest strength did not come from military power, but from its commitment to fundamental human values like dignity and respect. In 1995, on the 50th anniversary of the end of World War II, several of the women prisoners from Camp Harrington organized a reunion. They returned to Texas and visited the site of the former camp. They reconnected with American soldiers who had been guards there. They shared stories about their experiences. They talked about how the kindness they had received had changed their lives and shaped their understanding of what was possible between former enemies. Martha Kruger attended the reunion, now an elderly woman in her 70s. She had lived most of her life in Germany, working as a teacher, advocating for reconciliation between Germany and America. She had told countless people the story of the Easter candy and the Christmas gifts. She had become an unofficial ambassador for understanding between the two nations. At the reunion, she was reunited with Private Chen, who had also become elderly, but still carried the same warmth and kindness in his eyes that had characterized him during the war. They embraced like old friends. They sat together and talked about Camp Harrington, about Colonel Harrington's vision of treating prisoners humanely, about how those acts of generosity had rippled outward, changing the course of their lives and influencing German-American relations for decades. Martha told him, in her careful English that had improved greatly over the decades, "You gave me Easter candy when I expected nothing. You showed me that kindness was possible even in war. I spent my entire life after that trying to show other people that reconciliation was possible, that former enemies could become friends. Everything I did after I left Camp Harrington, I did because I had learned from you, from Colonel Harrington, from all the Americans who treated us with generosity and respect." Chen's eyes filled with tears. He told Martha that he had always wondered what happened to the prisoners after they left the camp. He had hoped that the kindness they had received had made a difference, had helped them recover from the trauma of the war, had shown them that America valued human dignity above national enmity. The reunion was documented by journalists and filmmakers. The story of Camp Harrington and its policies of generous treatment of prisoners was broadcast on television, published in magazines and newspapers. Americans and Germans learned about Colonel Harrington's decision to distribute Easter candy to enemy prisoners. They learned about the church groups that had collected Christmas gifts. They learned about the shoes and the fresh fruit, and the library books and all the small acts of kindness that had accumulated to create an environment where prisoners could be treated as human beings. The story resonated in both countries. In America, it became a point of pride, an example of American values at their best. In Germany, it became a symbol of hope, proof that even during the darkest chapters of history, compassion and generosity could survive and even flourish. Historians began to study Camp Harrington as an example of how to manage prisoner of war camps ethically. Military academies included it in their curriculum. Courses on military ethics referenced Colonel Harrington's leadership as an example of how to balance military discipline with basic human decency. The women prisoners who left Camp Harrington carried with them memories of kindness that lasted their entire lives. Some married American soldiers and remained in the United States. Others returned to Germany and worked to rebuild their nation. All of them remembered the Easter candy, the Christmas gifts, the shoes that healed their feet, the library books that gave them hope, the guards who treated them with respect, despite being on opposite sides of a war. That is the legacy of Colonel Harrington's decision to treat prisoners generously. It was not a decision that made military sense. It was not a decision that was popular with everyone. It was a decision based on a fundamental belief that all human beings deserve to be treated with dignity, that charity and generosity did not weaken a nation, but strengthened it, that the way we treat those we have power over reveals the true character of our nation. Years after the war, when people asked why America had treated German prisoners so well during World War II, why Americans had provided Easter candy and Christmas gifts to enemy combatants, the answer was always the same. Because we believed in human dignity. Because we believed that being American meant something more than just defeating our enemies. It meant building a world where former enemies could become friends, where generosity could triumph over revenge, where kindness could be stronger than hatred. That is what Colonel Harrington taught the women at Camp Harrington. That is what Private Chen demonstrated when he handed a young German woman her first Easter candy in years. That is what the church groups understood when they collected donations to send Christmas gifts to prisoners of war. That generosity, real generosity, the kind that asks for nothing in return and expects no gratitude, that generosity is revolutionary. It changes people. It changes nations. It changes the course of history. When Martha Kruger stood at the 50-year reunion of Camp Harrington and looked at the faces of the American soldiers and officers who had been kind to her during her imprisonment, she thought about the journey that had brought her to this moment. She thought about the Easter candy that had made her cry. She thought about the Christmas card from Sarah Johnson in Houston. She thought about all the small acts of kindness that had proven that her enemy was capable of extraordinary generosity. And she realized that the greatest gift she had received at Camp Harrington was not the candy or the gifts or the new shoes. The greatest gift was the lesson that generosity was possible, that kindness could survive war, that human connection could transcend all the barriers that governments tried to create between nations. That lesson had shaped the rest of her life. That lesson had made her work for reconciliation worthwhile. That lesson had proven to be more powerful than any weapon, more enduring than any hatred, more transformative than any military strategy. That is the true legacy of Camp Harrington, not just a camp where prisoners were treated well, but a place where a vision was realized, a vision that America could be generous to its enemies, that the nation could be strong enough to show mercy. That kindness was not weakness but the truest expression of American values. The German women who left that camp and returned to Germany carried that vision with them. They told the story to their families and their students and their communities. And through their voices, the message of Camp Harrington spread. The message that reconciliation is possible. The message that former enemies can become friends. The message that they were so kind, and that kindness changed everything.